On May the 10th, 1940, the Germans attacked in the west. In 9 days they advanced so far and so fast that the Allied armies of France, Belgium and Britain were on the verge of being cut in two, with one group, predominantly French, south of the River Somme, and the other made up of troops of all three countries, in a kind of semicircle stretching across Flanders and the north of France, deprived of its lines of communications and of great quantities of stores which lay in depots to the south. This situation had to be dealt with at once. Admiral Sir Vaughan Morgan was then Chief of Staff to Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsey, Vice Admiral commanding at Dover.
I represented Admiral Ramsey at 2 conferences at the War Office on the 19th and 20th of May, and attended a 3rd, presided over by the Admiral, at Dover on the 21st of May. On the 19th, I had no idea of the extent of the problem or the grave danger with which we were all to be faced. Neither, so far as I know, had the Admiral. Supplies for an evacuation of the army were considered in 2 phases. Phase A, to supply the army through Boulogne, Calais and Dunkirk, evacuating non-fighting troops, and Phase B, to prepare for a possible general evacuation. This operation became Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of the British Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, 1940. Our general plan for Phase A was to use personnel ships, mostly former cross-channel vessels, and supply ships. For Phase B, it was hoped to use boats off the beaches to the eastward of Dunkirk, and personnel ships, destroyers, minesweepers, etc., to lift troops from Dunkirk itself.
A week passed between the first meeting at the War Office and the decision to begin Operation Dynamo. During that week, the British Expeditionary Force, the BEF, had been hotly engaged. As usual, the troops in the thick of it had the least idea of what was going on. Major General Short, on May the 10th, was personal assistant to the British Commander-in-Chief, Viscount Gort, and later on the staff of the 1st Division of the BEF, commanded by General Alexander.
The first time one got any sort of an inkling of what was happening was at Armentières. On the map there you could see the Germans marked in coming in along the coast through Nieuport, and at the same time there was another arrow showing that the Germans had occupied Boulogne and were advancing on Calais, and that there were a pair of pinchers going to close between us and the sea, and I must say at that time it looked pretty unhealthy.
We seemed to be marching for at least a week, day and night, crossing rivers and obstacles of all types. The longest time that we were in trenches was on the Labassie Canal. We used the same trenches that were used in the 1914-18 war because we didn't have real time to dig in. And that was when we first met Jerry tanks, but we were over the canal in very good defensive positions, and at that time, although Jerry brought quite a few tanks up to attack us, we held our positions, and it was the battalion on our left that collapsed, and the tanks in their encircling movement surrounded us in the village. They held us down for about 8 hours until darkness, and then we broke out by going through their ranks, and by crossing 2 rivers we managed to form up with the old regiment, or what was left of them.
I was Padre with the 1st Royal Scots, part of the 4th Infantry Brigade of the 2nd Division. We moved into Belgium on the 10th of May, took up position on the River Dyle, and the battle came upon us quite soon afterwards. We moved back, fighting a series of rearguard actions, until eventually on the 26th of May, we took up position in the village of Le Paradis, in the Labassie Canal. The battle was joined there in the early morning of the day following, the 27th of May, the Sunday, and we had a very fierce engagement indeed, ending up by being completely surrounded by the Germans. I was in the REP, where We had, by the time we were surrounded, a fair number of wounded, and we hadn't been able to get away earlier. And in the RAP, quite near the battalion headquarters, we stayed until eventually some hand grenades came through the window, and to shouts of Hände hoch, raus, raus, we came out to find ourselves prisoners in the hands of the Germans. I had been wounded myself and was moved by the Germans to a field where they laid us on the ground, and from that position I witnessed their attack on the battalion headquarters in a typical North France house. It was very interesting to see. The infantry part of the assault was directed by a German NCO wearing gloves and wearing a white linen collar that peeped above the stiff grey colour of his uniform, looking very smart indeed. He instructed his little group of soldiers as to where the dead ground lay and what their line of approach should be to the house where the battalion headquarters was, and then, in the most leisurely way possible, drew a pistol from his pocket and fired a virée over the house. This was a signal, doubtless, to some gunners behind, because very rapidly a shell landed on the roof of the house, which went on fire. Incidentally, that had been their technique with our regimental aid post, setting the place on fire first. And then the German soldiers moved in along the ditches, using the dead ground very cleverly indeed. A most skillful, highly trained group of men they were.
Major Daniel of the Welsh Guards says,
I was commanding a platoon in number 2 company, and after various days of rest in the Lille area, we were told towards the coast in the area of Dunkirk. We were in trucks, and the journey was fairly eventful, with dive bombers and civilian refugees and causing traffic blocks and a number of unexpected incidents of all kinds. And we eventually got completely stuck west Capelle. We'd been told to stop in this village and hold it against anything that might happen, as a sort of outer perimeter to the defences round Dunkirk itself. And we spent the morning fortifying the place with holes and obstacles and all we could do to hold the grounds of this chateau against whatever might happen. It was a very lovely house with ornamental water and a beautiful bridge to the front door and large grounds with the wall round it. And my platoon had to hold one corner of the park. And the time we'd finished doing all we could, which was lunchtime, I suppose, it was a most lovely afternoon. It was almost like a summer picnic in a way. And I think I had a sleep on my lilo during the afternoon. And round about tea time, a lot of noises off. And then an enormous number of tanks started to drive past us. What I remember most, actually, is being surprised that when I fired my anti-tank rifle at a tank, it didn't immediately fall apart. Well, you know, one would be led to believe that that's the sort of thing that would happen. Anyway, they proceeded to fire back at us, and then started to drive in and around the garden and carved the place up to a considerable extent during the latter part of the afternoon. And we were eventually forced to retire into the house itself round about dusk. One tank fell into the ornamental water right outside the front door, but there was very little we could do about that. We threw things at it and fired things at it, and we didn't manage to set it on fire or anything, so it stayed there. Whether the people inside were alive, I don't know. Then we spent the next few hours wondering what to do, rather, and eventually it was decided that we should leave the people who were wounded and couldn't walk and just make our way across country on a compass bearing through whatever we might find. And we sort of rushed through the fence and over the road, and then through the night along the ditches and hedges and so forth in the general direction of Berg, which was the inner perimeter that was being held. It was quite an exciting night because you kept on running into bunches of Germans who weren't expecting you and you weren't expecting them, and everybody fired into the air in general directions. Of course, a number of people got lost, inevitably under those conditions. Eventually, sometime in the early morning, it was still dark, we crossed the bridge at Berg.
2 bold attempts had been made to delay the German advance by holding the ports of Boulogne and Calais, and at the last moment, destroyers were sent into Boulogne to bring out troops that were left. One of them was Venomous, whose captain was then Lieutenant Commander Macbeth.
My turn came to go in, and I went in with a ship called Wild Swan. Wild Swan led the fire of the Germans. I went to another berth, which had the disadvantage of giving a full-size target to the fellows who were shooting at us, but it did have the advantage that I was able to use all my guns and bring them to bear on the Germans, who are now beginning to appear in pretty large numbers from all around. My first lieutenant was on the bridge, controlling the gunfire, and he sighted immediately a series of field guns. They were about 1,100 yards away on a hilltop. There were about 7 or 8 of them, and he got his guns onto those straight away. Well, 4.7-inch shells with high explosives soon made pretty good messes of those chaps, and we very soon were able to shift to another target. There was a fort very close to us, I should think about just over 1,000 yards, and the guns of that fort were turned onto us and started shooting us up. But we managed to get a couple of good salvos, each with 4 4.7-inch bricks, into the fort, and large pieces of fort started rolling down the hillside, and so we had no more trouble from them. Very shortly after that, at a range of about 600 yards, 4 tanks came marching round the corner. I don't imagine that they expected to find themselves faced by 4.7-inch guns from a destroyer at a very close range like that, and anyhow we got them pretty fast, and we got all 4 of them. One of them went rolling down the hill into the river rather like a Catherine wheel. A little while after that, a sort of motorized column of about 15 or 20 cars and motorcycles and sidecar combinations with machine guns in them. They came round a corner of some buildings, and the 4.7-inch guns were at that time engaged with the tanks, but our pom-poms got amongst these motor transport columns, and they absolutely tore them to pieces. And in no time, all the cars were on fire, and unfortunate Germans running around in every direction trying to escape from the pom-pom fire and the machine gun fire, to say nothing of rifle fire, which was being used by some of the off-watch stokers and some of the torpedoes' crews who couldn't use their fish, of course. A little while after that, we found that a house the other side of the harbour, I should think within about 200 yards, was full of German army who were acting as sort of snipers in a great heap, and they were shooting at us. I think the German who got nearest to us while we were in there was about 60 yards away, and he was in a crane acting as a sniper, but he came down pretty fast. During all this time, the army were coming on board us. They were having to run from the old railway station buildings near our berth, and they had to go across about 60 yards, I suppose, of open quay, and the Germans were covering this pretty effectively, and there were a very large number of wounded lying around, and dead, of course, in the open area. Well, finally I got about 500 of these soldiers on board. I sounded a series of 3 blasts on the ship's siren, and still firing the guns, out we went, astern.
But there was no last-moment rescue for the troops in Calais. They were ordered to fight until the last, and they did. The commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, Queen Victoria's Rifles, says,
"The German forces gradually closed in round the entire perimeter, with fierce fighting ensuing. That evening, we were told that we were to be evacuated the following day, and in readiness for this were to withdraw to a position near to Calais harbour. The Lieutenant did this in the course of the evening. And occupied a position just beyond the sand dunes on the edges of the old Calais embankments. During the night, there was severe shelling, and the Germans approached considerably nearer and were hotly engaged even by the battalion from its reserve position. It was not known what had happened to the troops in front. During the night, there was considerable artillery fire and mortar fire, even onto our positions, and the following morning, communications seemed to be lost in every way. The attack by this time had got to such close quarters that Germans could be seen flitting in and out of houses and firing from windows within 200 to 300 yards. There appeared to be no general order as to what to do, and the troops remained fighting their own small battles as and when they saw the enemy, who was well trained and took every advantage of ground and cover to creep nearer under cover of their own mortar fire, which was very considerable. Finally, small packets of troops were left fighting out little wars independently and by themselves. And then the order arrived that everybody who could should carry on for himself and get away if possible. By this time, there was very little chance of doing that, because the battalion were right back on the shores of the channel, and there was no further means of retreat and no means of getting off to the ships that could be seen in the channel. After fighting there until the position appeared to be quite hopeless, one packet after another were forced to surrender, and so far as we were concerned, the defense of Calais came to an end.
To cover the port of Dunkirk and the long stretch of the beaches from there to Nieuport in Belgium, 16 miles away, a defensive perimeter line was organized. Part of this task fell to Major General Lord Burnham, then Commander Royal Artillery of 48th Division, but temporarily without any guns.
I was turned on to organize and command the canal defense from just northeast of Berg to the sea at Nieuport. I wasn't given any troops to do it with, but told I could collar anybody I could find. I expect as an amateur, I found these rather vague instructions less appalling than a professional would. The main bridges across the canal were at Furnes and Nieuport, and I made my headquarters at Furnes. At Nieuport, I was lucky enough to find the 53rd Medium Regiment, who, though the bridge had gone before they got there, were containing the Germans very well. Another godsend arriving about the same time as I did was a complete searchlight regiment who took on the defense of Furnes. The rest of the garrison consisted of subunits, mostly artillery and engineers, but a few infantry, collected as they crossed the canal, plus individuals formed into ad hoc subunits at my headquarters. The units were in pretty good order. The subunits showed no signs whatever of panic, but they were fairly scruffy, mostly very hungry and footsore, and all extremely lost. Individuals, even more so. I don't suppose more than about a couple of dozen, too shoky to be worth putting back into the line once we'd found officers and NCOs for them.
The BEF and a large part of the French First Army had got back to Dunkirk and the beaches, but it was no part of the British plan that the BEF should stay there. The French authorities, however, for some days believed that it would be possible for Dunkirk to hold out in the rear of the Germans, in the way in which a year later Tobruk was to hold in the rear of the Germans in North Africa. But the British, especially after the surrender of the Belgian army, were resolved to bring their people home and then send them back again to France further down the coast. Action was necessary on both sides of the Straits of Dover. In Britain, the first requirement was small craft and the men to man them. These would reinforce the ships of the Royal Navy and the merchant service already available, partly because there would not be enough of these warships and merchant vessels, partly because they were biggish ships which could only embark people either from alongside a pier or from small boats. The search for these boats and their crews began. The Thames was a fruitful source, mostly of pleasure craft and tugs. Mr. Tuff, a boat builder, remembers,
I had personally a call from Admiral Sir Lionel Preston, who was then director of the small vessels pool at the Admiralty, asking me to requisition all boats of small draft suitable to cross the channel. We collected about 100 boats. Admiral Sir Lionel Preston told me that the boats we sent over rescued between 3,000 and 3,500 people.
That sort of thing went on at most south and east coast ports near enough to the French coast. The men were as diversely gathered. All that was required of them was some knowledge of boat handling and a readiness to volunteer. Admiral Sir William Tennant, then a captain, was sent from London to organize the evacuation on the naval side.
Dunkirk looked pretty grim at the time. There wasn't a pane of glass standing anywhere in any of the buildings, and dead bodies from the last raid were still lying about, and the oil tanks of Dunkirk were on fire. We made our way then to the bastion, a very secure, bomb-proof place, which was being used by the French as their local headquarters, and they gave us a small compartment in this. I sent part of my party up the beaches to see what they could do, because there were 9 miles of beaches from Dunkirk up to La Panne. I had previously asked how long we should have for the job, and the generals I met said 24 hours, possibly 36. So we realized if we were going to do any good at all, we better get started immediately.
The task at first had been to get the British Army off, but it soon became much bigger.
My orders had been to get the BEF off, but after some days the Admiralty asked me to make arrangements for the evacuation of the French. I then asked them if they would be evacuated from the western side of the harbour, while our people continued to use the mole. Towards the end I was told by the Admiralty that I must share the mole with the French, and the next night resulted in more French than British getting off from the mole. But it was all quite orderly and calmly done.
A French officer evacuated with his unit is now a well-known journalist, Monsieur Jean-Claude Servan-Schreiber.
I was a lieutenant in the French cavalry in the French 1st Light Armored Division and had steadily fought the Germans from the 10th of May onward. On the 30th of May, we stayed in Malo-les-Bains for the whole day with no food, no water. We were one of those French units who remained very disciplined and fairly well organized till the end. The reason of this is that it was an active army cavalry unit, and I think in all countries that means the same. It must be said that lots of French soldiers who had been racing to the beaches were no longer in organized units. And of course, as soon as they saw those small British boats coming to shore, they wanted to get on those boats to get away from those beaches. Well, the responsibility of the British officers there was that they should take their men out and no one else. And so they did. Not always in a very pleasant way, but I must say as a French officer that I had on the next day exactly the same responsibility, and I acted exactly in the same way. On the 31st of May, we got an order that a French ship was inside Dunkirk harbor, ready to take us all, to embark the whole brigade, or what was left of them, got the order to walk along the beach straight to Dunkirk. When we arrived in the harbor, I had the order to put my men all along that ship and kick out any other Frenchman who wanted to get aboard that ship, and so I did. We landed in Dover in the evening and back in Le Havre on the 1st of June.
Commenting on the popular view of the evacuation, Admiral Tennant says,
I think the country naturally became very impressed with the endless stream of little boats and yachts and anything with an auxiliary engine, which left the North Foreland and steamed over to the beaches and collected a few soldiers and came back again. And they did do a very valuable share of the work. But by far the greatest burden and the heat of the day was borne by the destroyers and the personnel ships, the old penny steamers as we used to know them. They went backwards and forwards for the whole week. 6 of the destroyers were sunk.
One of the unlucky destroyers was Grenade. Serving in her as a supply assistant was Mr. John Ayres.
I realised then that I'd been thrown across the wheelhouse. In the opposite corner, there was a round hatch and a series of ladders leading down through the superstructure. A gusher of burning oil was roaring up through this hatchway and out through the cross-passage door at the back of the wheelhouse. This door was the only way out, so I jumped through the flames and out onto the starboard flag deck away from the jetty, just in time to hear another Stuka diving. I threw myself flat on the deck in about 3 inches of oil and water just as the bombs burst alongside, throwing a deluge of oil and water and mud right over the ship. I jumped up in time to see a Stuka pulling out of his dive a few feet above the water and make off over the West Mole. Grenade was well ablaze as I climbed down to the forecastle. Thick oil covered the water between us and the jetty, and as I went onto the forecastle, someone leaned over the bridge and shouted, "Don't jump over the side." I had seen fingers poking up through the oil and was not tempted to do so. One mooring wire remained uncut over the bows, and a rating was swinging from it, making his way hand over hand to the jetty. Several other survivors, burned in varying degrees, had by now collected on the forecastle. Together we hauled on the wire until the bows touched, and then climbed onto the jetty. The stern was fairly well down by this time. I asked permission to go aboard Crested Eagle, which was still unscathed and loading troops. I went aboard Crested Eagle for the first time since a pre-war day trip as a child. The Crested Eagle cast off and steamed away from the mole eastwards, parallel to the beach. She hadn't gone far when we heard another Stuka diving towards us. Immediately there was a rending crash, and out of the corner of my eye I saw the flash pass over us. The bomb had passed through the after deck some feet away and exploded among the packed troops. The Crested Eagle yawed about and finally grounded on a sandbank with her bows pointing onto the beach. Meanwhile, the fire was gaining from aft and the wounded were helped forward, where they congregated on the paddle boxes and forecastle. At one point there was a great rush of steam from the funnel, and I thought the boilers were going to explode. Some time afterwards I met a stoker who had been badly burned and was unable to swim, who told me he had stayed on the paddle box platform with his back to the ship's side, which was nice and warm by the time he was rescued. It was evident that few boats would be available for taking immobile wounded off the Crested Eagle. There was a minesweeper, Albury, not far away, so I decided to swim for it.
More fortunate was the flotilla leader Malcolm. Her captain was Sir Thomas Halsey.
We did the Dunkirk run for the 9 days, except for a day off, which greatly revived our tired ship's company. We had no casualties to the ship's company or to the soldiers we carried, although we topped the list, according to the Admiralty records, of the number of soldiers brought back to England by any destroyer. Our first arrival off the beaches with the other destroyers of 16th Destroyer Flotilla was about 1 in the morning. We stopped as near the beaches as we dared and sent in our 3 small boats, who struggled on all day. As in the Bible story, we seem to have toiled all day and taken nothing, or very little. Malcolm had 2 days of this, very frustrating for these swift ships, hanging about under bombing, which was sometimes intense. It became quicker and less frustrating when all the boats of England arrived to help this ferrying. After the sinkings of the 31st of May, we ran only between the Dunkirk pier and Dover at night. Each of the last 3 nights we thought was the last one. Each time the soldiers held the line and Admiral Ramsey called for another lift. The most spectacular one that I remember was arriving at about 2 a.m. to find the narrow entrance completely obscured by black smoke from the burning oil fuel tanks. Several ships were milling about in the roads waiting to go in. My talented navigator said that he knew our position accurately, so we plunged in through the dense smoke, I expecting to hit concrete. However, we emerged into the clear light of the dawn, the stars still just showing. All along the pier to port, infantry were fallen in. It might have been the Horse Guards. They looked splendid. We moved alongside the only ship. A few soldiers at an order grounded arms according to the drill book and took our bow ropes, and in a very short time we embarked in an orderly way more than 1,000 men. The very last day was the morning of the 4th of June. Each so-called last day we sailed with some apprehension, but heartened by our bagpipes playing us out. We arrived about 2:30 a.m. Express and Venomous were alongside the Mole, and we were the last 3, in the final, so to speak. We 3 cleared the pier of all troops, all French, and sailed Express last. On the way out, in the now uncomfortably brilliant morning, Looking over our shoulders for the Stukas, we met Shikari of my flotilla. I signaled to her, evacuation completed, return to Dover. As we passed her, there was a sucking great explosion, which was a magnetic mine close to her starboard side. She disobeyed my signal and sailed on into Dunkirk. I didn't know that she was escorting the block ships who were to make the port useless to the Germans. She did her stuff and found some more Frenchmen to take away. She was the last of His Majesty's ships to leave.
Everybody kept at it. Everything was used. In a ship's lifeboat was a theatrical producer, John Fernald, then an American citizen, perhaps the only one in the operation.
David Holman, the scenic designer, and I were waiting to go into the Navy. We were still doing our jobs in the theatre at the time, and as yachtsmen, we used to go to Captain O.M. Watts in Albemarle Street and take classes in navigation on Thursday evenings. And one Thursday evening, we were called into Captain Watts's study, who looked at us very gravely and said that volunteers were wanted for Dunkirk. This, of course, frightened us very much, but there seemed to be no way out of it. What we had to do was to travel in ship's lifeboats, which were towed by Thames tugs. They were to be towed across to Dunkirk in a V-shaped string, 12 ship's boats to each tug. There were about 4 or 5 of these tugs. And we were told that when we got to Dunkirk, the tugs would lie at anchor, we would be cast off, and we would row ashore and collect what soldiers we could and bring them back to the tug. So about midnight, we left Southend in tow of these tugs. Rather a splendid sight we were, because most of us were city gents, dressed in striped trousers, even a bowler hat I remember seeing on the head of a stockbroker who used to go to these classes at Captain Watts. And there he was in the boat abreast of mine with his bowler hat on, a white sweater, his city gent's natty suiting, striped trousers, and smart polished black shoes. We got to Dunkirk about 6, as far as I remember. We were cast off and told to go ashore. And so we rowed manfully in, about half a mile, 3/4 of a mile, straight into the beach somewhere a little north of the harbour entrance to look for what soldiers we could find. And we got ashore, and first sight we saw very little. And I was a bit worried because the tide had started to ebb, and I was terrified of finding myself stranded in Dunkirk, all the soldiers getting off and me being left behind. But I was relieved when over the edge of a dune I saw the most splendid sight, a detachment of guards drawn up, standing at ease with incredible smartness, in perfect line, obviously waiting for something. The trouble was they didn't appear to be waiting for us. We had considerable difficulty in getting them to recognize our existence. In fact, we looked shabby, we looked disreputable, they looked magnificent. They looked just like the guards do in front of Buckingham Palace. They looked down their noses at us. They wouldn't recognize our existence. I eventually found an officer and said, do come along, we've got a boat to take you off. And he looked extremely dubious about this. He said, well, I'll see what I can do. He eventually went off, and he came back again, having seen what he could do, and he consented reluctantly to allow his splendid fellows to get on board.
One of the personnel ships bearing the burden and the heat of the day was the Maid of Orleans. Her second engineer was Mr. George Tooley.
I think in all we made about 6 passages. And during that time, I think it was between 5,000 and 6,000 men we lifted from the beaches. What impressed me most at the time, I think, was the weather. And I remember at the time that trundling backwards and forwards that I didn't rate the chances of survival as very high, but it was a job to be done, and I think the people in the ships carried on and did their job as best they could. There were a lot of difficulties in the way of machinery troubles, and also the difficulty of navigation amongst wrecks. I remember fatigue and tiredness.
and the ships 2 and 3 abreast alongside the Admiralty Pier, Dover, the antiquated rifles of the French. But overall, there was a cheerfulness amongst the troops who came aboard, an orderliness, the way they moved onto the ships, although at one time the pier was being shelled and gaps appeared in the lines, the troops just moved up into the position, no panic, no undue haste. Things seemed incongruous at the time. During the murk and fog of the black smoke from the burning tanks, I remember seeing a naval commander, immaculate, with white shirt cuffs, pointing the way for some troops to embark.
Some of the cross-channel steamers were converted into hospital ships, which brought back the wounded to Dover. One of those who then helped look after them was Dr. Gertrude Thompson.
I was a surgeon during the time of Dunkirk at the Dover hospitals. We had large quantities of casualties in Dunkirk. The ones that came into our hospital were those who were severely injured and who were unable to be taken further inland. We had a very busy time. 3 of us were working. We worked more or less night and day. The casualties were first of all admitted and were sorted out by one of the doctors, and from there they were taken to the theatre where I worked. A great many of these casualties required amputations. There were also minor injuries such as severe lacerations and all kinds of wounds. When I had finished my work, I used to go down to see the ships coming in from Dunkirk. It was an amazing sight. The sun was always shining brightly and the sea was calm, and these ships, however battered they were, provided they were seaworthy, kept going backwards and forwards.
Unwounded and slightly wounded men had to be got away as quickly as possible. One of those responsible was Mr. W.C. Collins, the traffic assistant to the marine manager at Dover.
We were told that plans were being made for a heavy movement of troops evacuated from France. With the help of the other railways, an organization was set up to provide 186 trains, totaling approximately 2,000 coaches, in immediate readiness for working away loaded from the southeast ports. It was not until Sunday, May the 26th, however, that I was informed by telephone that the special working would commence that night and that preparations were to be made for the receipt. 25 trains were sent from Dover, and over the 8 days up to June 4th, 325 trains in all, fully loaded with troops, plus 8 ambulance trains, were dispatched without incident. Other ports in the vicinity with less facilities were working at full pressure, and out of a total of over 300,000, nearly 200,000 men were handled at Dover. When the trains left the ports, their destination was unknown, and it was not until they reached Red Hill that the military were in a position to inform the railway authorities the final destination.
Another railway worker on this job was Mr. A.R. Amos.
When the evacuation commenced, I was on spare driving duties, and I was called on duty at midnight each night from Monday night to Saturday night inclusive, which meant that during the Dunkirk week I had to forego a lot of sleep to get these troops away, and in actual fact I was 112 hours on duty during that week, which included 22.5 hours on the Sunday.
The women's voluntary services were in full force to help the returning men wherever they could between their ports of arrival and the distant camps to which they were dispersed. The Dowager Lady Reading, chairman of the WVS, remembers this story told to her by the mayor of a south coast town.
As the men came in, so exhausted that they fell asleep as they sat, the women rolled them into rows, the women stacked their equipment at their heads, the women washed their feet as they lay asleep, they stacked their shoes, and then they went away with the socks, went away to wash them. I followed the women to see what they were doing, and I looked at the water in which the socks were being washed, and I saw so much blood in them, and I marveled, and I thought, those men, how their feet have bled. Then I looked again, and I saw the blood was red blood, not brown blood, that it came from the hands of the women, not from the feet of the men.
On the vexed question of the air side of the dynamo operation, Admiral Tennant says,
"The RAF did their utmost, and their losses were very heavy. Many was the air battle we saw overhead, and bombers being shot down on the beaches and offshore. But the RAF couldn't in those days be over there the whole time, and on 2 or 3 occasions I remember when they'd finished their patrol and got back to England, the bombers came in and strafed us within 5 minutes of their departure."
Here are 2 aerial views on Dunkirk. First, Group Captain A.L. Deere, then a fighter pilot.
I well recall being briefed on the evening before the first sortie by the station commander, who said, "There's something gone wrong in France, and you chaps are required to go out and fly over Dunkirk, or in the area of Dunkirk. You were to go out there," he said, "and you were to look for enemy aircraft." Those were our instructions just then. For the first 4 or 5 days, or even up to a week of Dunkirk flying, we in the Royal Air Force, at least we pilots, were certainly not aware that the British Army was retreating. We came to realize this because I can recall very clearly one early morning flying by this time on a very familiar flight at about 5,000 feet over the French coast, and ahead of me, or to my right rather, seeing Dunkirk, well, literally aflame. Unhappily, Dunkirk for me finished up on the ground on, I think, the 30th of May, on what was to have been the last sortie of my squadron. We had up till this time flown, I should say, perhaps 25 to 30 sorties in a matter of 10 days, and lost in the process well over 50% of our pilots. The losses at Dunkirk, in quality, they were very heavy, because we lost all our flight commanders, in my particular squadron we did, and most of our section leaders. So those of us, like myself, who were pilot officers one day, 2 weeks later were flight commanders. On my last sortie, I was shot down over Dunkirk. So I had the unique experience of both seeing it from the air and seeing it from the ground.
And Air Commodore Clayton.
At the time of Dunkirk, I was in the Burnham squadron, and from the invasion of the Low Countries on May the 10th onwards until after Dunkirk, we were going flat out. On many occasions, crews flew 2 and sometimes 3 sorties a day. And to the uninitiated, this may not seem much, but when you think that each sortie entailed a briefing, a formation takeoff, maybe a rendezvous with another squadron, a couple of hours to get there and back, debriefing and rearming, and above all, a lot of hanging around waiting for the latest information on where the enemy had got to, and what our next target was to be, you'll appreciate that our day usually started before dawn and finished often after dark. From May the 10th onwards, our task was to try to slow up the German advance, to act, as it were, as a rearguard to our retreating forces. As the days went by, I don't think any of us appreciated that we were approaching the climax of Dunkirk. I know I certainly didn't. I knew that large numbers of troops were falling back on Dunkirk, but the first time I realized that something very much out of the ordinary was about to happen was one beautiful sunny day, and they were all sunny that summer, weren't they, when, on our way to France, about halfway between the mouth of the Thames and the French coast, we came across an immense number of little white boats. Stretching like a pale stream all the way back to England. We passed the head of the column some 20 miles from the French coast, and I remember the thought flashed through my mind that they must be carrying reinforcements. Silly in retrospect. And then we were beyond them, and ahead of us there was a pillar of black smoke from the burning oil tanks, which became such a feature of the Dunkirk scene. On our return, we were told the real reason for the small boats, and from then on, our targets were not many miles from the perimeter of the Dunkirk defences. Looking up the targets attacked by my squadron, I see enemy transport on the Dunkirk Ypres road, enemy transport on the Dunkirk Ostend road, road junction at Nieuport,
enemy guns in the sand dunes at Gravelines, and so on. We were often routed over Dunkirk on the way into or out from our targets, the idea being to encourage our troops on the ground by giving them a sight of their own bombers. I don't think the gesture was much appreciated. At all events, the area around Dunkirk was one of the places where we could be sure of being shot at by friend and foe alike, usually by both together. This, of course, was not surprising, as not only do people who have been beaten up by enemy aircraft tend to get trigger-happy and shoot at all aircraft, but in fact we were frequently tangled up with enemy bombers. On one occasion, 6 of us on a bombing run passed smack under a large formation of Dorniers going the opposite way, a few hundred feet above us, heavily escorted by fighters. As in those days we couldn't afford the luxury of a fighter escort ourselves, we thought we'd catch a packet. However, the German fighter boys were bombers. They may have thought we were bait. We certainly felt like it.
Although all unwounded troops, and a lot of those badly wounded, were being got away from Dunkirk, it was clear that not all the badly wounded could be removed. This meant that doctors and medical orderlies would have to be left behind to take care of them. One of the RAMC officers who stayed behind was Dr. Newman.
On the 31st, our unit was ordered to evacuate to England, leaving behind 1 officer and 10 other ranks for each 100 wounded. The commanding officer, Colonel Pank, gave the order that a ballot should be held in the mess room, and peculiar enough, somebody had found an English bowler in the basement of the chateau. This was brought to light, and the Roman Catholic Padre, Father O'Shea, was chosen to draw the tickets. My name came out 17th of 17, so that I knew that I had to stay behind. The casualty clearing station was then in a rather dreadful state. The wounded were still pouring in, walking about the grounds. There was very little food, and we were drinking water straight out of the village pond. During the Sunday, the wounded still came in. There was still a little fighting by the French, but most of our troops had withdrawn that night. And we saw the last of the BEF disappear across the sea. The fighting continued by the French on Monday the 3rd and died down that evening, and it was quite obvious that the Germans were going to come in on the following morning. We saw the white Very lights go up from their front line, and we posted an officer and 2 men by the front gate with a red lantern. Fortunately, in the unit we had a German pilot who was wounded, but he was very helpful and told us the appropriate things to say as the Germans came in. And I have here still a little bit of paper that I wrote down with a red pencil, such phrases as Ruten Kreuz, Nix schießen. The Germans came in at about 6 a.m. that morning, and the front-line troops, just as weary as we were, sat down with our wounded and swapped rations and family postcards and photos. This continued for about 2 hours, and then they went on their way, and in came the Gestapo and the back-line administrative troops, and they were not nearly so pleasant. They pinched most of our rations, and it wasn't for another 24 hours before we got any German issue.
Another medical officer to stay was Dr. Forsyth, but only just.
The only way you could get the stretcher across to the destroyer was over a plank from the top rail of the mole to the rail of the destroyer. And you had to climb up on the plank and go over with the stretcher. I had just done this, and she cast off. And I found an officer and said, "Here, I'm supposed to be ashore. I've got some work to do." And he called up to the skipper and told him. They talked, and then he said, "Afraid he can't make it. Better come and have a drink." So we started down below. I was just getting near that whiskey when a lot of clanging of bells and movement, and he said, "I think he's trying to bring you round again." So I went up on deck, up in the bows. He took the destroyer back a bit, and brought her in, bows on to the pier, and I stepped off, and I don't think he touched the pier at all. It was the most beautiful bit of boat handling I ever saw. But I often thought of that whiskey in my next 3 years in Germany.
One of those who had been helping with the collection and care of wounded across the wide battlefield which was the area through which the BEF had withdrawn was Miss Davis, then a sister in Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service on No. 1 ambulance train.
We had very badly wounded people, and our job on the train was to get them down, to get them home. We did what we could for them, fed them and did the first dressings, but we've no theatre on the train. And the thing is that we just do to alleviate as much as we can. The next morning we got down, and all the way down there were refugees which blocked the way, and we got things into a little bit like ship-shape order, and then all of a sudden we heard these planes coming over. You could see them, they were so near, you could see the swastikas on the planes, definitely. And we had one Air Force officer with us who was very badly wounded. He was burnt and he was blind. But he recognized the sound of these planes and he got rather upset about it. The planes just seemed to be passing over, then they suddenly turned back and they machine gunned the train at a very, very near range. We had children on this train who had been very badly wounded in Belgium, and they were all naturally very upset about it. One civilian woman was killed, and she was buried by our troops on the trackside.
By now, nearly all that was left of the BEF was back on the beaches.
We worked our way down till we got into Dunkirk itself. This was on the Wednesday morning, and we hadn't had anything to eat, no rations or anything. In fact, I think the last to eat we had was 16 kilometres outside of Dunkirk when we came off the canal on the Saturday. And we got into a farmyard and stole a few chickens, and we made a big stew, 5 or 6 of us, and in fact we carried half of that stew down to the beaches, but we lost it before we got there. The officers had a do out of it, the sergeants had a do. If they only knew what the sergeants got that day out of the stew, I think a few of them would die of fright today.
We arrived on the beach, I don't know what time, I would think about 2 in the morning, and there were people, officers, calling out, this way, No. 2 company, this way, the Grenadiers, and so on, the usual sort of assembly point noises. Very shortly after that, I heard someone call out that the planes were coming over, we must keep still. The sand was very wet. It was a bright night, and if you moved, your footprints made phosphorescent sort of shimmers, which was as good as flares to the pilots. We laid flat on the ground. The next thing I remember are the horses. How many there were, I don't know. I remember on the march down from way back inland, all the animals were being driven with us. It was very much like a forest fire, this German panzer set up, so that animals, human beings, and the lot were all being driven forward to the sea. I remember seeing dead animals, horses and things lying around, the same as one saw men. So I think that what had happened was that certain of the animals, like certain of the human beings, had arrived at the beach. And the thing I remember about the horses were that they raced past us up and down, and quite a number of men were, at any rate, injured, I think killed, by simply getting a horse's hoof through their skulls. There were pigs and sheep and various other things down there, chickens too. It was a chaotic setup on the beach. I remember a beautiful little river craft, pleasure craft, yacht, with 3 boys in white cricket shirts and flannels, punting away. I shouldn't think they could have taken more than 4 people.
Dunkirk was ablaze, and we got onto the dunes at night. Woke up next morning, I dropped on a Scotch lad, and all we had between us were a bottle of gin, and that kept us going for 5 days. And then walking on the beach about the 3rd morning, me and this boy, there was a major and a padre talking. This padre asked the major, he says, now then, what chance is it, what we've got of getting off? Oh, he says, you see the smoke on the horizon there? I said, yes. He says, that's the Navy going out. He said, I don't suppose we'll see them again. I thought, I says, my mate, sounds good, doesn't it? Anyway, we kept going back into the dunes, getting to sleep, coming back the next day. The Navy kept coming. Anyway, I think it was about either the 4th or the 5th of June when I got on the boat. I had to swim 100 yards. I never done that before in my life.
Major Fox, then the Regimental Sergeant Major of the 12th Royal Lancers, says,
After destroying all our vehicles, the regiment marched down to the beach at La Panne, where we thought we were going to embark, but instead we were giving another role of making a bridgehead of vehicles to form a landing for evacuation of troops. This we did all through the night of the 29th of May. Finally, when that was finished, no more boats could leave that point, and we then marched along the beach to Dunkirk, where the regiment was formed up in its squadrons. The officers were all smartly dressed as usual. The roll was called. The officers in their SD and Sam Browns, those that had got them still. We then were marched off into the sea, got into small boats, and the last person to leave the beach was our commanding officer, Colonel Herbert Lumsden. He had taken off his clothing to save it from getting wet so that he could always maintain his immaculate appearance. The last I remember seeing of him was sitting on the roof of his staff car, which at this stage was awash in the sea. And the peculiar thing was the windscreen wipers were still working on that vehicle. And he had his suit of SD held on his head to keep him from getting wet.
Finally, the Germans fought their way against British and French opposition to within a few hundred yards of the port, and further evacuation was impossible.
On the evening of the 2nd of June, our last day, Admiral Ramsey sent over 2 motorboats for our final evacuation. It was just about time, too, for the enemy had begun shelling the mole from the direction of the beaches. On arrival at Dover, it was a happy moment making a signal to the Admiralty. The BEF evacuated. Evacuated, yes, but although my team had done a fine job, it was really not due to anything that we could do or could have done had we not been very blessed by Providence and the stupidity of the enemy. For if Hitler had sent in his panzers onto the beaches in the early days, the whole story would have been a very different one.
The reasons why Hitler did not send in his panzers to the beaches in time to destroy the BEF are discussed by General Fonseca und Etterlin, a distinguished German military authority.
The most interesting valuation of the situation comes from Guderian, commander of a panzer corps at that time, who was really the man who did most for creating the panzer troop in the German army before the war. After a tour around his corps positions at the encirclement line of the British Expeditionary Force, he says, continuation of operations is not desirable as it's costing unnecessary sacrifices. Armored divisions have only 50% of their armor strength left. They are in urgent need for repair if the Corps is to be ready for other operations in short time. Then he thinks that the marshy country round Dunkirk as a whole is unsuitable for tank attack and that they rather have to wait. Infantry is more suitable for fighting in this kind of country, and the task of closing the gap on the coast can therefore be left to them. The command posts were all in a pronounced hesitation and in some lack of confidence regarding the full extent of the victory they had already achieved, and they therefore were reluctant to go on attacking in a westward direction and were rather inclined to fortify their positions which they had reached.
The combined efforts of the British and French navies and merchant vessels had secured the evacuation of over 300,000 men, but 40,000 Frenchmen, including some of those who had helped to hold the perimeter to the last, fell into German hands. To the French, Dunkirk was the prelude of a great disaster. To the British, it seemed almost a victory, despite the Prime Minister's warning that victories are not won by withdrawals. But to British and French alike, what was achieved was a near miracle and formed the foundation for the triumphal liberations of 1944 and 1945.